On May 29, 2003, as the white night winded down and day began, the police department in Pirkkala, Finland, received many bizarre calls. The first contact was from a woman who claimed that they had been told about a murder that had happened the night before, in which a man had been dismembered. Officers did not hold much weight to the initial call because it was hearsay. However, they began to take the first call a bit more seriously when they received a call from a woman claiming that she had been witness to the killing. The officer replied with, "Wait, are you serious?" These calls would lead investigators down a path to the discovery of atrocious and shocking crimes. Who was this victim, and who was the monster who had murdered and dismembered him on the Midsummer holiday? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. Midsummer, also called Juhannus in Finland, is the celebration of the summer solstice and occurs in late June. In Finland, it is a time to welcome in its white nights, since it doesn't get dark there during this time of the year. Between May and August, the sun never sets at all. The midnight sun above the Arctic Circle bathes the country in a mystical, reddish-yellow light, making it appear as if it's in a constant state of setting or rising. It creates a magical time for Finns who can now relish in the light after being in the dark for so many months. A popular way to spend the holiday of midsummer is to light bonfires or koko and bathe in saunas. Many often relax in boats, go fishing in the lakes, and barbecue. Throughout the ages, making noise and partying has been a common way to celebrate midsummer, as it is believed that loud behavior helps to draw in good luck and drive evil spirits away. It was once a popular time for casting love and fertility spells. The cities hold open-air dance traditions since the streets are virtually empty, with so many Finnish being away on holiday in the countryside. It is within this magical and breathtaking setting that one of the most horrific and disturbing murders in the country would take place. What many would describe as one of the most appalling in all of Finland's criminal history. These are the dismemberment murders. Arto Malinen was a hardworking young man. At only 26 years old, he had called the Tampere region his home for the last 3 years. The night was young and he felt like celebrating midsummer. He left his place in Pirkkala and headed to the city center to be in the middle of the excitement. Unfortunately for him, his path would cross that of a depraved and brutal young woman. The following evening, police received a call from a woman claiming she had been inside an apartment when a murder and dismemberment had taken place, and she named the perpetrators. Officers arrived at the residence of Arto Malinen, and an investigation promptly ensued. When investigators entered the deceased victims' homes, blood spatter dashed across the hallways and the floors, and there were traces of blood that had been attempted to be erased. A woman identified as 31-year-old Virpi Butt was there. She babbled on to the police about the night's events, sharing a lot of disturbing, revealing details with the detectives. The police began an immediate search for the body. In a trash can on Rautatiankatu, they discovered a most hideous sight. When the officers lifted one of the lids, they found 2 severed hands. Other officers would later locate the victim's body parts inside a trash can on Pirkkala. The investigation into Arto Malinen's horrible murder and dismemberment would lead homicide detectives to 2 offenders who had been suspects in another case of murder and dismemberment that had taken place a little over 1 year earlier. Virpi But 31, and her best friend and accomplice, Jani Hivanen, 29, would be arrested and charged with double homicide. The prosecutor Nerman, in what I would describe as an interesting and unexpected, although quite effective approach to the trial, presented both homicides as not separate from one another. Rather, they should be viewed like a sick play and two acts. Horrible, senseless murders that were committed by the same offenders, with one playing the role of the killer in the first death and the other as the spectator, and then performing opposite roles in the other. They also fit the same motivation, which was nothing considered rational, nor a crime of passion. Neither act of murder was committed with any other motive other than wanting to kill. Both murders also involved the desecration of a corpse. The following sequence of events is believed to have unfolded one night in early May 2002. Kari-Pekka Antonen was a computer programmer from Mikkeli who moved to Tampere to study. At one point he had been in a long-term relationship, which had since ended, and it seemed to have a negative impact upon his mental health. He was struggling with depression and consuming a lot of alcohol. He had known Virpi since 1994, if not earlier, before they began seeing one another romantically, earlier in the year of his death. Kari was only 29 years old when he was brutally murdered by someone he cared for and trusted. Virpi and Kari-Pekka Antonen, along with her friend, the second defendant, Jani Hivanen, were observed drinking at the couple's favorite restaurant in town, Sputnik. At Virpi's suggestion, they ended up going back to her apartment. Sometime in the early morning hours, Jani Hivanen attacked Kari, stabbing him in the back. He then slit the man's throat. Blood gushed from his neck and sprayed onto the walls and the floor. Together, Virpi and Jani scrubbed the blood the best they could manage and dragged the body of the victim into the bathroom. Jani later began the dismemberment of the corpse. He cut him into several pieces, which he and Virpi disposed of the remains throughout the city in different garbage bins. At the time of his disappearance, the two defendants had been interviewed by the police, but there was no evidence linking them to any crime. According to the second defendant, Jani Hivanen, they had all been drinking together heavily that night. He alleges that he doesn't recall the exact moments that led up to the altercation, but he did remember stabbing him and then slicing his throat open. Jani Hivanen described how he dragged him into the bathroom where he chopped him into several pieces. He saved the legs, though, and placed them inside Virpi's oven. Jani Hivanen claimed that he ate the victim's legs after roasting them. He then placed the remaining body parts inside garbage bags and proceeded to drink heavily over the next couple of days. Jani Hivanen had been a casual acquaintance with Kari for a few years, knowing one another from the local pubs. Although Jani and Virpi had only been good friends, even describing themselves in the court as having a brother and sister-like relationship, it was believed that Jani Hivanen desired Virpi. Something in him snapped that night toward Kari, who was involved with her. He admitted to the court that he was a little jealous of Virpi, especially her being with Kari. According to Jani, he and Kari Antonen had run into one another the night of Midsummer. They were all drinking at the restaurant on Kari's dollar. Kari was so intoxicated before even entering the restaurant, apparently, that he had to be carried inside it. After having several more drinks, he passed out. It was Virpi's suggestion that the three of them return to her place. It is not known precisely what happened that led to Kari's death, but Jani began to hit him. As Kari laid on the floor, Jani climbed on top of him and continued to beat the man, hitting him more than a dozen times. Kari Antonen struggled to survive against his relentless attack. At some point, Jani Hivanen stabbed him in the back with a switchblade he had on him, hitting his spine, but the knife didn't go all the way through. Kari was still breathing. Then Jani went into the kitchen and pulled out a large knife. He returned to Kari, bruised and bloodied on the ground, held his neck from behind, and slit open his throat. Jani and Virpi dragged Kari into the bathroom. They had to figure out something to do with his body, so Jani reached out to some of his friends, since neither himself nor Virpi had a vehicle. However, none of his friends were interested in helping them with this criminal task. It dawned on Jani soon after that Kari's remains would have to be dismembered. Jani left Virpi inside her apartment with the dead man's body while he went back to his own place in Tamela Tempre to fetch some tools for the job ahead. Jani did his best with a knife, but realized it would take far too much time and effort to complete such a mission. Then he noticed that Virpi had a saw. Sawing off his head first was Virpi's idea. Next came the areas where the man was tattooed, and then the tips of his fingers, which Jani said in court he knew would help to conceal his identity. Then he sliced into his legs, separating the body at the knees. In Jani Havonen's own disturbing words, he matter-of-factly told the court how he threw Kari's legs into the oven, seasoning them first, and then baked them. Although Virpi Butt did not participate in eating the victim, after Jani decapitated him, she strangely and grotesquely kept his head for herself. As if she were a victorious warrior, it was later reported by more than one person how Virpi Butt had proudly showed them his head, claiming, of course, that it was just a stage prop. She proudly brought his head to the market and even bragged about it amongst fellow patrons in the restaurant. She kept the head with her inside a plastic bag and would carry it inside one particular restaurant where it was observed how she would slam the head on the table. Virpi Butt even declared that inside the bag was a piece of Kari. But no one ever dared see what was inside the bag. A few attempted to open it, but Jani would kick the bag with his head at them, which caused them to flee in fear, running out of the restaurant's doors. Detectives later interviewed the security guard at Sputnik, who was familiar with all three persons. He described Kari Antonin as a calm, very nice guy, who drank regularly but not to excess. He also mentioned that at one time he and Virpi had fallen asleep at the bar. In contrast, he described Virpi Butt as behaving quite violently and aggressive at times. Virpi Butt was so unabashedly arrogant about the crime that she had even told the security guard that she could bring the body parts in there to show him. During the trial, Virpi Butt claimed that she had kept the head to herself to show it to people in hopes that someone would report it. She said she was afraid that she had no other choice to be complicit in the crime, since if someone had known about it, her kids would be taken away from her. However, her behavior during and after the murders and dismemberment implied quite the opposite. When Kari Antonin was being viciously slaughtered, her 2 young children were there inside the home. Her child of only 2 years old was sleeping in his crib in the room where Kari Antonin was killed. Her eldest child, a 16-year-old, was sleeping in a walk-in closet, but was awakened by the chaotic events of the night and saw the dead body more than once. A friend whom Jani had contacted in the spring of 2002 testified in the court how he had made a cold call to him, saying that he needed a van. He testified that Jani said his hands were covered in blood and that a body was in the bathroom. A different friend of Jani's also received a bizarre and unsettling call from him about a year earlier. Jani had told him that he had come with plastic bags, but that his friend didn't know what was inside them. His friend claimed to have ended the conversation right then and there, but Jani went on to tell him how he had beaten someone so severely that the man's head was almost taken off. It all sounded so ridiculous that he didn't take him seriously at the time. Jani Huvanen's friends were also scared of him and especially Virpi. They considered them to be a threat, and one witness, who was a former girlfriend of Yanni's, would only testify in court if the defendants were not there in her presence. Once on the stand, this woman described how in the spring of 2002, Virpi Butt had called her, inviting her over to join them for some chops. When she arrived at her apartment, Yanni said to her, and I quote, "You can look in the toilet if you can stand it." The woman walked toward Virpi Butt in the kitchen, who suddenly turned around, staring at her, blankless, holding a large knife in her hand. Then the woman looked over and saw the head near the stove. She noticed how the hair on the head had been cut off evenly, as if in a salon. The woman sprinted to the hallway as fast as she could, but they told her it was a suki, which is a doll's head. She never thought of it again until the investigation. Virpi Butt had also intimidated her landlord, who had a very hard time getting the woman to leave, who was behind on rent. When Virpi Butt was finally evicted, the landlord received a text message that said, and I quote, "I'll crush your head too." Kari Antonin's body was distributed amongst 3 packages, which they kept on Virpi Butt's balcony since, as you can imagine, the packages had begun to reek. That next morning, one of Yanni's friends showed up at the house and carried the 3 packages away. According to the driver of the packages, he claims that he went to the apartment to get a hangover cure from them, and the conversation quickly changed to him taking out the trash. Virpi and Yanni asked him if he had a car they could use so they could take out this stinking trash. He agreed to help and drove his vehicle to the backyard. The man initially believed that the packages were stolen goods, but when their putrid, overwhelming smell told him otherwise, he didn't want anything to do with these bags of trash being inside his car. But he felt intimidated by Yanni and Virpi, knowing that they could become violent, and so he did what they asked of him. They wanted the packages to be taken to Nokia, but he refused. It could not be determined as if this friend was aware of what was inside the packages or not. Virpi Butt sat in the car while his friend transferred the packages one by one into the car. The 3 of them then drove to a landfill to dispose of the body parts. Later on, they placed the head inside a large pot and turned up a burner on the stove. When the prosecutor inquired as to what he did with the head, Yanni Havonen explained how he just watched the head boil over as it began to smile in the steaming water. He shared in court how he just sat in the kitchen, drinking wine and laughing to himself, while the head's expression changed. Yanni also stated that he didn't pull the teeth out. That was due to the boiling. When the prosecutor asked him, "What kind of feelings does this act cause?" Yanni Havonen almost cheerfully said to the court, and I quote, "I wonder how you could do something like that. I have gotten the feeling that I can do anything. I can even eat the body." However, despite the events that unfolded that dreadful evening, Yanni Havonen swore that he never had any intention on killing Kari Antonin. He just wanted to scare him off so that he would leave him and Virpi alone. According to the testimony given by Virpi Butt, their stories mirrored one another's. Virpi Butt had been in a relationship with Kari Antonin for around 6 months and had never had any issues with him. She confirmed witnessing Yanni slit Kari's throat when asked about the victim's head being placed in a pot and his legs being cooked and eaten. Virpi Butt strongly denied eating him and that she saw Yanni hit his teeth while his head was cooking in the pot a few times, but none of the teeth came out. When asked why she thought Yanni Havonen would do such a thing, she exclaimed that it was probably for fun. Although Kari Antonin was not killed, with Virpi's butt's hands. She also did nothing to stop it. The prosecutor painted her as if she were an approving spectator, egging Yanni on to murder him. It was as if their sick, competitive dynamic helped to fuel this violence. For 2 excruciating months, a minimum of 4 officers and an excavator searched through the landfills, with no results. To this day, the body of Kari Pekka Antonin has never been found. The following sequence of events, according to several witnesses, in addition to the defendant's testimony, occurred on Midsummer Eve, 2003. Yanni Havanen had stayed at Virpi Butt's home to tend to her 3-year-old son, while she went out to buy some spirits for them for the night. That is when she came across Arto Malinen. She and Arto hit it off big, and they wanted to party together, so she went back with him to his place in Pirkkala around 4:08 a.m. Virpi Butt ended up spending the entire night with him. The next day, they decided they wanted to extend their time together, and so they headed over to one of Virpi's friends. They all decided to go out for drinks at a restaurant. Allegedly, Arto Malinen was wasted, but everything was fun and chill for everyone involved. Then, out of nowhere, everyone was forced to exit the restaurant because apparently Virpi Butt was not wanted there. The group ended up moving to the city center, where one guy who was looking to buy some marijuana ended up joining them. Virpi Butt told him that Malise has some flowers, meaning that Arto Malinen had some amphetamine to buy. According to the witnesses, they all took a taxi back to his place. During the trip back, he kept falling asleep in the taxi, and Virpi would shake him violently, trying to wake him up. The guy who had been looking to score marijuana that night offered Virpi a diazepam tablet to help her chill out a bit. But when they all came back to Arto Malinen's place, there were no drugs. The young man began to become anxious and paranoid that he was being cheated out of his money. He demanded that he be given money to take a taxi back to the city center. According to the witnesses there, Virpi Butt agreed with the young man, which really pissed Arto off. He told her that along with his kid to get the hell out of his apartment. An altercation between them then happened. Arto Malinen now laid in the fetal position on the floor, begging for someone to call an ambulance. He had multiple bruises and contusions. Suddenly, Virpi Butt left the room and returned with a large knife from the kitchen. She stabbed him in the back over and over, at least 13 times. Arto Malinen laid bloodied and butchered on the floor. Virpi Butt called her best friend, Yanni Havanen. When he arrived, they dragged Arto Malinen into the bathroom, stabbing him once more with a knife. Virpi Butt then lifted his head over the bathroom sink and slit his throat. It dawned on Virpi that someone still had to take care of her 3-year-old son, since she really needed Yanni's help dismembering the body. She gave that responsibility to Maria, someone who had been there when the murder occurred. Together, Virpi Butt and Yanni Havanen dismembered Arto Malinen into several pieces. Virpi Butt did not keep the victim's head, as she had earlier with Kari's, but instead she stole some of his money and took a knife of his as her trophy. In Virpi Butt's words, she got in the middle of the fight between him and the younger man. Arto had placed the younger guy in a chokehold and had slammed him against a wall in the apartment. Virpi Butt located a long-bladed knife somewhere in Arto's residence. She confronted the 2 men, just hoping to end the fight. But Arto Malinen was stabbed with a knife in the back, all the way to the handle. He pulled the deeply plunged knife out and stumbled to the ground. Virpi Butt claims that she was in shock over what had just happened, and in this haze, she stabbed Arto Malinen several more times in the back as he lay helpless and bleeding, lying on his stomach. Virpi Butt stated in the court that Arto Malinen's murder was not cruel. He had been killed in about a minute, and therefore her victim did not suffer from any unnecessary pain. The police believed that Arto Malinen had also been beaten since he was covered in bruises, yet Virpi Butt strongly denied having beaten him. The prosecution pointed out how the victim had been stabbed 13 times, and before having his throat slit, there was plenty of time in between for him to suffer. However, it was later learned that Virpi and Yanni had tried to drive over Arto Malinen's head in a company yard. But since his head kept slipping to the side, they failed at this decapitation. According to Virpi Butt's testimony, they first removed Arto's clothing, and then they began to cut him into pieces with a knife and then a saw. According to Yanni Havonen, though, Virpi was the one, not he, who decapitated Arto Malinen. He sawed off the left hand, and Virpi helped saw off the right. Yanni Havonen pulled out his internal organs, which were hidden inside a plastic bag and sprayed with water. The smaller organs were set aside in both a bucket and inside the toilet bowl, which he handed to Virpi. They did this so they wouldn't be appalled by the smell. Yanni Havonen described to the courtroom how exhausting the process of cutting up Arto Malinen's body was. He and Virpi would take turns dismembering him and drinking beer, and have smoke breaks in between. He compared the dismemberment method to body parts on a conveyor belt. Yanni Havonen told the court how he behaved like a machine and didn't feel any emotion at all while cutting up the body. When the prosecutor asked Virpi Butt why she called Yanni that night, she started cracking up and replied, "I guess I couldn't call my mother." She simply said that she knew that Yanni had experienced dismembering a body and that she could trust him 100%. Maria, the woman who was taking care of Virpi's 3-year-old son while the other two were dismembering the body, testified as to how Virpi had threatened her life. Now, Virpi claimed that she didn't necessarily threaten to kill Maria, but just like she never planned on killing Arto Malinen, but it did just happen. When Maria testified, she requested that Virpi, Yanni, and the man the media would refer to as Juna be removed from the courtroom due to her severe fear of them, but especially toward Virpi. Maria shared the night's events, including how Arto Malinen was so intoxicated on the way back to his house that he couldn't even remember where he lived. Later on, when Arto left the room to use the restroom, she observed how Virpi Butt was shaking uncontrollably and that she was holding a knife. Virpi stood in the kitchen, grinding the knife against the stove, sharpening its blade. She announced in a threatening tone that there would soon be a body. Maria went to the kitchen and heard a loud noise. When she entered the living room, Arto was lying on the ground in the fetal position. He was begging them to please call for help, but Virpi forbid them to call an ambulance. From the bathroom, Maria heard Juna say, "I'm not going to watch this to the end," and he fled the apartment. When Maria opened the door, Virpi was standing over Arto Malinen's thighs. Her legs were spread apart, holding a bloody knife over his body, saying, "Oh, fuck, what did I do?" Maria attempted to put on her shoes and leave as fast as possible, but Virpi told her, "You're not going anywhere." Arto was not dead, though, and he tried to drag his body forward, but Virpi stopped him from freeing himself. Later on, Maria heard Virpi Butt stab him, ending his life behind the closed bathroom door. Virpi but demanded that Maria go to her apartment to look after her young son. When she arrived, a man was there, helping to get rid of the garbage bags, which contained parts of Arto. At first, she tried to stay calm and just take care of the young boy. But then she had him put his shoes on, and she fled the residence with the young boy. When she arrived back at her own place, she contacted Virpi but to let her know that her son was safe there with her. But Virpi again threatened Maria, saying, "If you call me again, I'll shoot you." Maria was overwhelmed with fear and wasn't brave enough to report to the police what had happened that night. She confided in a couple of her friends, but no one believed what she told them. They told her to get a life, that she read too much Alibi, which was a popular online news source in Finland. 2 other men related to this murder also faced charges. The man who drove Virpi and Jani to dump the body parts in the trash, and the second was the man who helped to instigate the fight with Arto Malinen. He was charged because he failed to contact authorities about the stabbing he witnessed. According to the young man who has been called Juno in the media, although his identity for some unknown reason has been protected, the night went from bad to worse. When the group arrived back at Arto Malinen's apartment, the hostility between them only increased. Arto would come toward him aggressively, but Virpi and Maria would step in between them to try to calm things down. Maria had been excessively drinking Arto's liquor, which he made clear he was unhappy about. Arto handed him a matchbox, thinking it had drugs inside, which is why he had gone there in the first place. But then there were only matches inside it. Arto would then apologize to Juno, telling him not to worry, that he had drugs around here somewhere for him to buy. Everyone just kept drinking, including the victim Arto, who would sometimes just collapse down in the hallway. Juno just wanted to leave, and he asked for their help for taxi fare so he could go. He finally was handed 20 euros, but when he turned to leave, Arto Malinen ambushed him. He began to choke him. Juno kept trying to leave, and Maria wanted to go now too, but Virpi but wouldn't let them. She finally allowed Juno to go, but told him, "I'll kill you if you do anything." The young man was petrified of Virpi but, and when first questioned by police, he didn't make any sense at all, because he was too scared to tell the truth. Jani Havanen expressed no concern for how the media, the court, and the victim's loved ones perceived him. He was so distasteful, disrespectful, and antisocial that he literally wore his victim's clothes, a hooded sweatshirt that he had stolen from Kari Antonin, to his trial more than once. Virpi but was described by the prosecutor as being a misandrist. This is a term for someone who holds contempt, prejudice, and a deep hatred and loathing for men. It is the opposite of the commonly used term misogynist. It is hard to argue that she placed all of her rage and violence toward the opposite gender. It was not lost on the court and the media how during the murder trial, Virpi but showed no reserve. She did not attempt to be somber and respectful. She laughed and said inappropriate, sarcastic, and tongue-in-cheek statements. Toward the end of her trial, she showed no emotion and attempted to present herself in a more polished and calm manner. But it was too little, too late. In June 2004, Virpi but was found guilty on 1 count of murder, a breach of peace, and for protecting a criminal, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Jani Havanen was found guilty of the same charges and received the same penalty. Now, you may be thinking, end of story. These disgusting monsters remain in prison for the rest of their lives, but this is not where the case ends. This is Finland, and life imprisonment does not equate to an individual spending their life in prison, as it very often does in the United States. It is critical and important to understand and view this case through the lens of the legal and justice system in Finland. Finland was occupied by Russia from 1809 to 1917, whose authoritarian model heavily influenced its legal and justice system. Post-World War II, Finland was heavily weighed down by the cost of their prisons, primarily due to crimes of theft. They were faced with serious issues within the Finnish prisons, including a lack of space, food, clothing, and health care for the inmates. By 1945, they had made subtle but effective changes regarding clothing choices, food options, and smoking liberties. The legal system began to view the prisons in a different way. Instead of demeaning the prisoners and controlling them, their goals began to shift toward rehabilitation and transformation. However, there was a bit of a backlash toward this new treatment by both society and by the Hansakalo Committee, who investigated conditions inside prison in respect to the safety of the guards. This led to a brief return to the harsher sentencing and fewer liberties for inmates of the past. Then during the 1960s, when the country began to adopt a system more inclined to the interests of social welfare, it began to reevaluate the entirety of its criminal justice system. Criminologists in Finland started attending various international conferences on how prisoners should be treated. Their policymakers researched and analyzed many Nordic countries whose criminal justice systems were based upon the principles of maintaining a prisoner's connection to society. These other countries had strong evidence that their less punitive approach directly led to a low rate of criminals reoffending. What was referred to as the November movement in 1967 established a new perspective towards the criminal justice system and its prisoners. This movement, utilized by the newly found prisoners' union called National Convict Alliance Crim, it sought to learn about the prisoners themselves, about their personal backgrounds, their experiences before and while in prison, and what awaited them on the outside. They used the media and brought these individual stories to the public, which helped society to view prisoners in a more relatable and sympathetic manner. This directly led to major reform and policy changes, in particular towards offenders who commit lesser serious crimes. It is believed that their transformation of their legal system directly impacted the country's crime rates. Today, Finland proudly carries the title of having one of the lowest per capita crime rates in the world, in addition to having one of the lowest rates of recidivism in the world. For perspective, their recidivism or reoffending rates are 35%, compared to the United States, whose rates are as high as 82% in some states. Specifically, 82% of all U.S. prisoners return to the system within 10 years of being released. This is a direct reflection of our country's current approach and crime control-based model, which does little to nothing to help reform offenders, much less prepare them to succeed in society once they leave. Finland's focus is not on individualized sentences, rather on uniformity, with an emphasis on rehabilitation and reintegration into society. During the 1960s, international discussions were being held centering around increasingly more academic criminology and the evidence behind the methods used and less restrictive prison systems. One particularly influential discussion was held at the Nordic Criminology Seminar in 1965, which posited that the more closed, that is, the more restrictive and controlling prison conditions are, the worse of an effect it has on the setting and its inmates. This concept of a closed versus open prison would make a significant impact on Finland's further reform. The Penal Code of Finland grants the judge absolute authority in deciding whether an offender's sentence is conditional or unconditional. The exception to this rule is if the offense is very serious, the guilt of the offender is expressed in the seriousness of the offense or the criminal history of the offender. The Sentences Enforcement Act in Finland, whose core focus is on human dignity, has established the following requirements. Number 1, punishment is a mere loss of liberty. Number 2, prevention of harm, promoting of placement in society. Harm inflicted upon the prisoner must be prevented and the focus placed on their return. Number 3, normality. The conditions of the prison must be organized so that they fit within the rest of society's circumstances. Again, the emphasis is the difference is a loss of liberty. 4, justness. Respect for human dignity. Prohibition of discrimination. Number 5, special needs of juvenile offenders. This includes offenders 15 to 20 years old. Any offender under 15 years old is not criminally liable. Number 6, hearing a prisoner. The voices of all prisoners must be allowed to be expressed in accordance to their dwelling, job, activity, or anything that may affect their treatment. Number 7, prisoners have a right to vote and can do so from prison. Finland imprisons fewer offenders than any other country in the European Union. Even in closed prisons, there are no walls or gates. Instead, they have opted for unobtrusive camera surveillance and electronic alert networks, in stark contrast to most other prison environments, which are defined by their iron gates, metal passageways, and dire prison cells. The prisons of Finland more or less resemble a dormitory. None of the guards carry guns, and they wear street clothes or basic uniforms without any badges or emblems. In what are referred to as open prisons, prisoners are not known by numbers, but instead by their names, which is how the guards address them. If fights or drug possession becomes an issue, a prisoner can be placed in solitary confinement with a maximum of 20 days, although the average is 5 to 6. Again, their legal system sees punishment as a process to help shape morale and positively affect behavior, instead of being used as retribution. The criminal justice system of Finland basically includes 4 options. There are fines, community service, a conditional sentence, which is another way of saying probation, and then an unconditional sentence, which requires time in prison. However, for those who are given unconditional sentences, which is commonly used, the vast majority are released about after half of their sentence has been served. Compare this to the average of 80% being required to be served in the U.S. before parole is even a possibility. Finland's government, and therefore its social structure, is based upon social welfare, and so there are not extreme fluctuations in class. There is a high amount of trust and faith in its institutions, including law enforcement, and the lack of social and economic disparities, which almost all other countries are inflicted by, decreases the violence associated with it. As of 2023, Finland had 3,166 prisoners, with 2,100 of its offenders inside closed prisons, of which there are only 157 females. The United States currently has over 2 million people incarcerated, which roughly equates to 580 people in the system per 100,000, which is the highest ratio in the world. Finland has 52. And for the 8th year in a row, Finland has been ranked number 1 as the happiest country in the world. Once Virpi and Jani Havanen were handed down their life imprisonment sentences, these 2 friends quickly became enemies, blaming one another in the Court of Appeal. They both made arguments that they should receive a fixed term penalty for manslaughter and not first-degree murder. Jani Havanen claimed that his actions did not constitute the definition of murder. Virpi laid the guilt at her extremely hormonally imbalanced condition. In addition to alcohol and drug use, that led her to act out in ways outside her normal nature. I think as the prosecutor portrayed her, as was that her intention was to overpower these men, show them that despite the fact that she was a woman, they were still subordinate to her. According to Virpi's testimony, even though she hadn't been using steroids or AAs for 10 years, her hormones were still deeply impacted by her heavy use of them. Virpi was a familiar face around the world, as she was one of the most popular cast members of the show Gladiators. For those of you who are younger or who were never exposed to the show, which is still ongoing, it was an international game show where male and female contenders compete with a cast of gladiators and various athletic events. The gladiators were extremely muscular, athletic young men and women. Virpi Butt joined the cast in 1993 and at age 21 was the youngest Finnish female gladiator. With long blonde hair and her strong, fierce build, Virpi Butt, whose stage name was Timantti, which means diamond, became a powerful, recognizable force on the show. According to a few of her past cast members, though, she didn't fit in and was often quiet and withdrawn. Behind the scenes, Virpi Butt was obsessed with becoming as strong and muscular as any man on the show and was consuming similar amounts of steroids to become as large and as fit as possible. So could have Virpi Butt's long-term and excessive amount of steroids have affected her so severely that it was a factor in her violent and brutal behavior? Anabolic androgenic steroids, also known as AAs, are a widely spread issue in the world of professional athletes. Approximately 3 to 4 million people in the United States use the drug, and tens of millions do worldwide. It is believed that 98% of the users are male, but some women do partake as well. Research has shown a strong connection between its use and aggression. Although most users don't experience severe side effects, and particularly regarding behavioral and personality changes, for those who do, the effects can be severe and devastating. AAs effortlessly pass through the blood into the brain, affecting the central nervous system. This helps to understand why research indicates that they have a severe effect on neurological functioning, including cognitive and mental abilities. Data estimates that as high as 1 in 3 of all AA's users develop a dependency on the drug. Similar to other drug addictions, they ignore the terrible side effects and potentially permanent damage done to their minds and bodies in return for the high, or the benefits of the drug. Not unlike other highly toxic narcotics, steroids can impair the areas of the brain which control emotions and cognition, including the amygdala and the frontal cortex. However, the extent of the aggression exhibited by its users is dependent upon additional factors. Individuals who have committed violent acts, in particular murder, while under the consistent use of non-medical steroids, are often linked to aggravating lifestyle choices, such as the use of alcohol and other drugs. Mental health conditions appear to play a significant role in the causation of violence by people who take AAs, with antisocial personality disorder found to be a relatively common. There is an ongoing discussion and conflicting studies on if long-term and high levels of steroid use cause antisocial behavior, or if it triggers an already underlying mental problem. As early as the 1980s, research showed various adverse side effects of steroids upon the personalities and behavioral characteristics of its users. They often manifest themselves in extreme manic episodes or prolonged behavior, such as a hyperinflated self-confidence, irritability, hyperactivity, impaired judgment, aggression, violence, and although rare, even psychosis, specifically experiencing paranoia and grandiose delusions. During withdrawals, individuals may suffer from fatigue, the inability to sleep, lack of appetite, depression, and suicidal ideation. Some studies have suggested that it's not necessarily the use of AAS that leads to aggressive behavior and violence, but that aggressive individuals prone to violent behavior may be drawn to taking them. This, in combination with other substance abuse from alcohol, cocaine, and opiates, may culminate in actions of violence. Some AAS users have described what the media would commonly refer to as roid rage, as more of an obsessively, slowly growing explosion versus a random outburst. Users have explained how obsessive thoughts would eat at them until they lost it. One particular study talked about how such violence or criminality associated with some AAS users is often accompanied by anosognosia. Neurologist Joseph Babinski coined this mental disorder when a person doesn't have any consciousness that they are sick. Such an individual has little to no awareness at the time of their violent or criminal actions that what they are doing is wrong, until afterwards, in which they are often shocked, appalled and very confused as to their earlier behavior. The delusional experiences of some users who exhibit violence or criminality report feelings of invincibility, which may be connected to this neurological disorder. They are not necessarily psychotic in the traditional psychiatric meaning, but at the time of their actions, they don't understand or comprehend the wrongfulness or abnormality of what they are engaged in. Women who use steroids especially regularly are extremely uncommon. Most females are turned off by the adverse side effects their femininity will be inflicted with if used in heavy doses. For some, women are permanently masculinized, and not just muscle mass and strength, but in ways that are very unpleasant. Women's voices deepen, their breasts become smaller, their body and facial hair increases, and they experience enlargement of the clitoris, in addition to menstrual irregularities. They can also cause serious damage to the heart and liver, as they do in males, and negatively affect their mood, personality, and change their behavior. Now, even if they did permanently alter her behavior and personality, to what extent does that justify Virpi Butt's horrendous actions? To claim that her increase in testosterone led to her involvement in the murder and dismemberment of 2 innocent men is ridiculous and unfair. That would give men in general a biological or chemical explanation for why they behave violently when most of them don't. So what then could have possibly triggered her vile behavior? From a criminological point of view, her crimes are not typical of a female criminal or even a murderer. Most women don't participate in the brutal slaying and dismemberment of their victims, much less carry around their head. Of course, there are exceptions, but what does this say about Virpi Butt? I think it says more about her twisted relationship with Yanni Havanen than anything else. Together, their sadistic tendencies fed off of one another, helping to release her inner monster. Virpi and Yanni had all signs of being psychotic, not only from their crimes, but how they handled themselves in court, especially in front of their victims' families. That is not indicative of a person who is hormonally imbalanced. Those are signs of an unempathetic psychopath with antisocial tendencies who could care less about what anyone thinks of them or their actions. Virpi Butt and Yanni Havanen are best defined as being hedonistic killers. They were stimulated by the process of the murders and the dismemberment. The deaths of Arto and Kari did not necessarily include torture or any intended method to extend their deaths. These twisted friends received their real pleasure in the act after their victims were dead. As defined by Ronald Holmes and James de Burger's motivational model for serial murderers, a hedonistic murderer, of which there are 2 subtypes, one being lust-oriented and the other thrill-oriented, based on their actions before and after the killings, it appears as if Yanni and Virpi fit within both subtypes. Thrill-oriented hedonistic killers are motivated by the thrill of killing, but tend to be less interested afterwards in the victim, since their fantasy has peaked during the actual murder. Lust-oriented killers, on the other hand, are motivated by sexual fantasy, and the fantasy often extends after death, including mutilation of the body, necrophilia, and cannibalism. Granted, Yanni and Virpi were not technically serial killers, but their modus operandi and behavior place them in a similar perspective. They both engaged in the dismemberment of their victims. They played with the body parts. Virpi even kept Kari's head, and Yanni cooked and consumed a piece of him. All of these elements describe a lust murder. However, the way they mirrored one another's actions from one murder to the next shows how they were stimulated by the violent, disgusting behavior of one another more than the murders on their own. While in prison, Virpi Butt changed her name to Lucretia Francisca Pandora Butt. As to why she did this, I would presume because once released, she wanted to live her life without being under the incessant scrutiny of the media. Since she doesn't deserve to have anything but misery after the heinous crimes she committed, I will not refer to her by her new name. Since 2016, Virpi Butt was held inside an open prison. The Criminal Sanctions Agency had assessed her comprehensive forensic profile and concluded that her likelihood of reoffending was very high. However, it was taken into consideration that Virpi Butt had been a successful inmate while in prison. She was involved in work and different programs, including steps to earning a higher education. She was a mother of 2 sons with strong ties to her family and claimed to be fully committed to her sobriety. This unfortunately outweighed the concerns and analysis provided by the criminal analyst, much to the dismay and disgust of her victims' loved ones and concern from the community. The Helsinki Court of Appeal released Virpi Butt on New Year's Eve, 2018. From what is known, she relocated to a small community on the border of Pirkkala and Satakunta. She had purchased a home a few years earlier while still in prison. The man whom she bought the house from apparently fell in love with her, and they got married once she was released. Some of the neighbors who were interviewed by the media were shocked to hear that this brutal murderer was moving into their town. However, at least according to one neighbor, they weren't particularly concerned that she would start killing all of the neighbors off one by one. They believed Virpi Butt was in a bad state at the time of her offense, and they think that people can make amends for their crimes. Neighbors did report some strange behavior over the short period Virpi Butt lived there. They said that any activity observed in the home was primarily at night. Someone said how they witnessed her shoveling snow in a manic, frantic state in the middle of the night. Another stated how she would throw gunpowder and even coke into the air. She did not interact with them at all. Virpi Butt only resided in the residence for less than a year, maybe even a few months, and then she was gone. She and her husband disappeared, and their house fell into foreclosure soon after. There was no word from her until a blog surfaced in December of 2019. It was allegedly written by Virpi Butt. It stated that she had moved to the other side of the world, so she was free of the oppression she faced living in a small town. Strangely, the post included very specific details that matched what the neighbors had said about her during her time with them, including how she had to remove snow after dark. The authenticity of the blog has never been verified. Virpi Butt's husband managed to survive living with her until June 2021, when he filed for divorce. In November 2021, Virpi Butt, 49, was found dead. An autopsy was performed and the official cause of death could not be determined. It was believed by the police, however, that no crime had occurred. In early March 2018, Virpi Butt's partner in crime, Jani Havanen, was released on parole after serving 15 years and 9 months. The Helsinki Court of Appeal noted how he had been a model prisoner and had studied catering and agriculture while in prison. Jani had also committed to staying sober. No more than 6 months into his parole of 3 years, he became excessively drunk and was arrested for drinking and driving. From all sources that I have read, he remains in prison. At least the people outside the prison don't have to live in fear of this monster wanting to all of a sudden murder and eat someone else again. The murder of Arto Malinen and her involvement in the desecration of Kari Antonen's body may not be the only murder Virpi Butt was involved in. In 1999, a young woman named Reisa Räisänen disappeared. On the weekend of October 16th through the 17th, witnesses in the streets of Tampere saw 2 women, one who fit the description of young Reisa, and an older, much larger woman who could have very well been Virpi Butt. The eyewitnesses were confident that Virpi Butt was the second woman accompanying Reisa that weekend. Not only was she very recognizable from being a star on Gladiators, but she was a very large, muscular woman who stood out amongst the Tampere nightlife. Peculiar tips flooded in once Reisa was brought up in the media again. One person claimed to have found an item in the forest, which they believed may have been related to her disappearance. One witness reported to investigators that in the fall of 1999, while he was driving past Hotel Talmarie along Ragankatu, he spotted then 27-year-old Virpi Butt. She was walking on the opposite side of the road with a tall and very nicely dressed younger woman. Virpi Butt appeared to be intensely focused on the younger woman, who attempted to keep pulling away from her. He witnessed what seemed to be a verbal altercation between the two women. Based on information provided to the police from an acquaintance of Virpi Butt's, she pinned this young woman and was hassling her for what sounded like a demand for money. Although Virpi Butt was quite muscular and large, Reza was a basketball player, stood around 5'7", and was wearing high heels that night. For some reason, this person never reported this information to the police until late 2016, which was 17 years after Reza had vanished. Another witness that same weekend observed something similar. A woman along with her husband were waiting for a taxi outside of Hotel Tamer about 1:30. She saw two women approaching in the direction. The younger woman was very tall and had on a miniskirt. She appeared to be a little intoxicated. The second woman was described as being much older, with long blonde hair and a thick, muscular build. This eyewitness had reported to the police what she had seen that night. Reza had disappeared. Another person also noticed the two women walking late that night. He noticed that the younger girl, who looked to be about 18 years old, was wearing a miniskirt and a black blazer with black high heels. She was obviously quite tipsy, walking clumsily down the street. The women didn't seem to be getting along. This witness also didn't inform the police as to what he saw that night until late 2016, when the story resurfaced. One particularly disturbing story was told by a woman who awoke in the middle of the night to a blood-curdling scream. She claimed that she heard two screams. The first was long and very alarming, and the second scream was short. At the time, she thought it was coming from the car wash that was nearby, so she didn't give it much thought. Later, she remembered that she heard these screams sometime between the 16th and 17th of October. In 2006, a man who was a street musician reported something disturbing he had encountered back in 1999 or 2000 involving Virpi Butt. He was familiar with both her and Yanni Havanen from the pub scene there, and one night he asked if she had any beer in the backpack she was carrying. She kneeled down and unzipped the bag, saying to him, "It's not just a human head." At first, he believed it had to have been the head of a mannequin. There was no blood on it. After the murders of Kari Antonin and Arto Malanen came to light, he remembered that strange, ominous night with Virpi Butt and the head. Later, he would tell investigators that he was 95% positive that it was a girl's head. Some of these important tips were not reported to police at the time of Reza's disappearance. It wasn't until years later that officers finally received information to point them in the direction of a viable suspect. Their evidence was sufficient enough to warrant a wiretap on Virpi Butt's phone from the end of 2019 to 2020. Unfortunately, any suspicions around Virpi Butt were not looked into soon enough. She was dead before investigators had the opportunity to ever interview her. Officers today are still exploring the possibility that Virpi Butt was her killer and have carefully analyzed her movements around Reza's vanishing. As of this recording, the disappearance and likely murder of Reza has yet to be solved. If Virpi Butt murdered Reza, what other disappearances and deaths could she hypothetically be involved in? What about Yanni Havonen? His actions and attitude were equally as depraved and sick as Virpi Butt's were. I have a strong doubt that Kari and Arto were the first people to cross the paths of these sadists and end up losing their body parts for knowing them. What are your thoughts on this twisted, dark case of murder and dismemberment? Do you think they were isolated incidents, triggered, driven by alcohol abuse, substance abuse, mental illness? Or are these two just psychopaths? And there are more victims out there. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I'm beyond thrilled to be your host. Until next time, stay safe. And watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Lita Caldwell. Original music Stranger by Stereocode.